And welcome back to the show. We're talking with Suzanne Bernier about climbing the continuity career ladder for millennials, but at the same time, it could be for just about anybody. Suzanne, in the first segment, there were two areas that I just wanted to comment on. One, I'll ask you a little bit more details. You said focus on one area, and I just wanted to say that I'm not a big fan of being asked what a person's strengths and weaknesses are. And I liked your comment. When you focus on a single area, my belief is that you will become good in that area. And if you do have weaknesses or perceived weaknesses, they will actually get stronger because you're more focused and you can actually deal with it, rather than focusing on what's perceived to be weaknesses. You don't actually move forward. You just kind of stay where you are. So I really like your point about focusing on a single area.
Yeah, and that's a great addition too. A good point, Alex.
And the other thing is you mentioned the ice storm here in Canada. Can you give a little bit more detail on that? Because we have listeners around the globe, but they may not be familiar with when that happened and the extent of what happened.
Yeah, this was back in early January of 1998. And we had an ice storm that was going through the eastern part of Canada, specifically Quebec and Ontario, were the affected areas. And while Quebec and Montreal area were most of the highlighted affected areas, so if some people across the globe might have heard of some of the news, they might have heard more of it looking like it impacted the Quebec area, which it did. And there were hundreds of communities that were impacted for weeks at a time and were without power in that area. But they were also affected on our side of the provincial lines as well. So on the Ontario side, on the eastern Ontario side, we had 66 communities declare an emergency alone in our province. Had never been done before and has never happened since. Imagine, again, 66 communities having to declare an emergency at the same time in one province or one state, in one specific area. And this was during the height of winter in that specific part of Canada, as is much of Canada at that time in the beginning of January. And in a lot of areas that were isolated or remote areas and hard to get to once the power was out, it took us, and this us, I'm talking about emergency operation centers opening up and coordination from all levels of government, including the federal levels, Department of National Defense, the province, all of the communities that were affected, as well as the region of Ottawa, the federal government level, all different areas and emergency operation centers working together just to make sure that we could, one, get information and resources out to people and generators and other ways to be able to provide power and resources to people for an extended period of time, and to prioritize how and when to give power back to people safely. It was a huge endeavor that we'd never faced before in this country and have yet to face since. We've seen several smaller ice storms and, of course, fires and devastating floods across Canada as well. But to date, that was still the one largest response effort that we've had to respond to as a part of the province of Ontario in a larger effort like that. And it did last, as I said. So in the end, it lasted about 5 weeks in total until we could actually get power back to the remaining areas that had to have power back up and running. It was a very large endeavor.
It was, and to visualize it, picture the large power lines, the big towers, that carry the power lines everywhere. They were all folded over. The weight was so heavy. Trees all across cities, and towns were just flat. It was unbelievable. I remember going through that myself, and it was just incredible.
So I don't know if maybe that will lead me to, or that'll lead to the next section, which is getting back into those tips for people as I've been experiencing that disaster and then responding to different other ones as well. Things that I've observed and thought, I'd like to share with people, and it might help them as they're thinking of different ways to move up or different areas they want to go in this type of a career. So one of the other things I noticed in that response, as well as anyone that, and I'm sure you can vouch for it as well, is the positive side of disasters as well. And so that's something that I wanted to focus on, and then veered me in this whole other area. But then it helped me be able to enhance myself as well, and my skills and my marketability without me realizing it until afterwards, which was, okay, so I had noticed and knew that being a former journalist, but then being responding to emergencies and being on the background of things as opposed to be just seeing things on media. I knew that there were a lot of positive stories from disasters that needed to be shared, that the media didn't have time perhaps to focus on so much. And I wanted to do that. And so part of the time when I would volunteer, and that's another thing that I would give a tip to people, is if they're able to take time to volunteer, even if you've got 2 weeks vacation, and maybe, and I'm not saying to be a saint and devote all of your 2 weeks that you have limited vacation to go and volunteer somewhere after disaster. However, even just volunteering a day somewhere, taking the time out of your week. Let's say if you're going to New York with the family for a week, take the time for the day to find a volunteer organization that's setting up people to help where they're still rebuilding after Hurricane Sandy. Or if you're going to Texas or wherever it is, think about maybe an opportunity to take a day or two or a week if you can, or whatever it is, to volunteer, because that's how you're also going to get more experience and exposure being involved in responding to those disasters that you normally would never get called out for or deployed at. I never would have got deployed at Katrina, but I wanted to go and help volunteer. So with different organizations, I was able to have that opportunity to do that and return regularly to be able to help rebuild and then, get involved within that whole network of Hurricane Katrina's rebuilding efforts. And that was really so I was getting to my next point, which is kind of now, that's getting into my next point, which was that was really what inspired me to then write a book on the positive side, because when my first volunteer experience with Katrina, I had seen all of the media coverage beforehand, but then when I got on the ground, I realized, wow, there's so many great things and positive hero stories that nobody's hearing about and that we really need to be focusing on. And if nobody's going to write about them, I'm going to. And that's really kind of how I got inspired to write a book called Disaster Heroes. And I just thought, well, there's all these great things, and we should be focusing on the positive side as well of what goes on behind the scenes. Not just people like us who do what we do and are trained, but I'm talking about everyday people who step up and do amazing things to help
Can you give us an example?
Or save lives after disasters. So that's what I did. I decided afterwards that, okay, I want to focus on looking at finding these everyday heroes that have stepped up after the world's most significant disasters from 9/11 onwards, and kind of did that. But then from there, I would want the journey that led my journey and my career further, and I had no idea it would. So much so that I'm not going to say the whole journey, but so much so that I'll just say that in the end it led me to an invitation to be able to speak at the White House in 2016. And it was all based on because of being able to, write the book and focus on the positive side of disasters and just, thinking about something and following it through. And little did I know that would then happen. And I'd be speaking at this FEMA event at the White House in 2016. And then it's kind of launched me to be able to speak at all these other conferences across the world. I'm going back to Australia in August to speak at another one. But it's all just, and I'm not any better than anybody else in the field. It's just about putting yourself out there. And then, you speak at one conference, you write a book, and then people hear about you. And it's just, if you want to increase your marketability, now I'm realizing these are some of the ways that have helped me be able to do that without me even realizing it as I was kind of going through the process myself.
So you got to put yourself out there. Can you give us an example or two of disaster heroes? just to
Sure.
have a little bit of a positive. I know we're talking about ice storms and
Yeah.
so
You
many
know
other
what? I'll
things, but
share the first story that's in the book because he's the inspiration for the book, and it kind of is a really great example, and it covers three different disasters in one. So there's this one fellow, Ronnie Goldman, and he's the first hero I talk about. And I met him actually during a rebuilding in New Orleans because he's a New Orleanian. And he was a phone engineer with a phone company based out of New Orleans. I met him after Katrina, but his story is about what he did after 9/11. So after 9/11, he and his wife were listening to a broadcast of President Bush at the time, who was giving an address at Ground Zero. And what he noticed specifically was at the end of the address, when the camera panned out, he noticed that President Bush was standing on the shell of a burned-out fire truck. And Ronnie remembered hearing news reports about how not only all of the hundreds of lives that were lost, but also the hundreds of service vehicles that were lost that day as well. And he thought to himself and commented to his wife, somebody needs to raise some money. They need to rebuild back the fire department. How are they going to get these vehicles back? And so just with that one idea, instead of, most of us who'd be the armchair critic and think, or, look at this news report and think, well, I hope somebody thinks to do something about that. Or, I hope the government is able to give them money to be able to replace their vehicles. He actually thought, well, why don't I maybe come up with a fundraising idea and see if the residents of Louisiana want to come up with a fundraising campaign. So he called a local radio talk show the next day, put that idea out there, and then 3 months later, they were able to raise enough money to build and deliver the first of several fire trucks that rolled all the way from New Orleans to New York City as a gift from Louisianans to New York to help them rebuild after Katrina. Just a beautiful story of how one man and having one idea and just picking up a phone made him a hero to the community of New York City after 9/11. But the story doesn't end there. So little did Ronnie know that 4 years later, he's telling me, that Katrina would happen, his own community would be affected, and the same amount of firefighters that were lost in New York City after 9/11 accompanied that first fire truck that was donated by New Orleans, the Spirit of Louisiana, and they came all the way back to New Orleans to help New Orleans rebuild after Katrina. Again, thanks to the Spirit of Louisiana and that one idea that Ronnie had 4 years earlier to save another community. And then the story doesn't end there. A couple years later, the Spirit was now in a fire museum in Baton Rouge. Then Hurricane Sandy happened in New York. They recommission the fire truck and they bring it back to New York City, where it then helped rebuild that community after Hurricane Sandy. So just one example of one everyday hero who, just having one idea and picking up the phone and doing something about it, helped save three different communities rebuild after a disaster.
That is a nice story. I like that.
Yeah.
So if let's say, I know you've got some tips from your experiences. What do you suggest if I'm brand new? I'm fresh.
One of the first things I'd say is if you're brand new in the field, is to be able to join some of the great associations that are out there. There's so many different industry associations that on the local level as well as the regional level and the state level or the provincial level up to the federal level. So do some research on what those associations are and be a member. And usually a lot of these local associations, it's pretty reasonable to be a member, but the investment of being able to do that is just so much worth it, to be able to have that networking opportunity, to be able to meet with and talk to and be able to possibly get mentoring, advice, and opportunities from people who've been in the field for a long time. And the best way that I've seen to be able to do that is to be part of these industry associations. That's also a way where you'll be able to figure out and distinguish a little bit more the different areas within business continuity and emergency management and risk management so that people can be a little bit more clear on which area they want to focus on and become more of an expert in. as opposed to others. That also will then help figure out, being part of these associations or an association, you'll also find out a lot more about different things that will help you as well, like certifications. Depending on, again, I can't give advice yet, depending on, all I can say is I think getting certification in an area that you're interested in and want to become a specialist in, I think is ideal. And there's so many different certifications out there. It all depends on what you want to focus on and what your specialty is. But I highly recommend that as well. But people who are new in the field might not be familiar with that. But the best way for them to get knowledge of what these different certifications are and then get a feel for, well, does that make sense for them or not, to proceed with that, is being part of these associations and just the chats and the discussions that you have. And again, one of the biggest things that I've seen from being part of associations that I've been privileged to be a part of and receive great mentorship advice from people who'd been in the industry for a long time and who I just knew. And this is another piece of advice for people is, and sometimes it's hard for people who might not be people persons to be able to have the, the gumption to go up to somebody. But, people in the industry, and I'm sure you're aware of it, Alex, you see it all the time. People really want to share, and that's what this industry is all about. And that's what makes it a really great and really special industry in the first place. So people who've been in this industry for a long time, for a number of years, that you respect and that maybe you've followed, if you're able to call them up or link them in on LinkedIn, and I'll get into LinkedIn too if we have time for that, because I think that's a huge asset for everybody as well, to be able to gain connections and recognition in the field as well. So that I kind of lost my train of thought there. But in the end, yeah, I think being able to network, putting yourself out there, being able to get mentorship from people, approaching people, and my final thought on that part was that pretty much anybody that you want to approach and you're going to ask them if they'd be willing to share their advice on career advice or mentoring you, in this industry, I'd say most of the time you would not get a no on that. So I would highly advise people to do that. Seek out those people that they've heard about, that they read about, that they know that they really admire and respect, and link them in and ask them for a quick chat to find out more about them and if they have advice for them.
I agree with that. And I have a comment, but I think you've touched on it, and I'm not going to go there because I know in our next segment you want to talk about LinkedIn. So I'm not going to say anything right now. We've come to the end of our second segment, and we're talking with Suzanne Bernier and tips for climbing the continuity career ladder. We'll be right back.
If you like that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.